Last time we had a look into the ideas and steps used to create this wall of shelves for a big box game collection. And this time I will show you a way to nicely store a different type of collection, gaming magazines. But of course, like with the shelf construction, you can use the whole thing to display other stuff as well. Like your favorite comics, for example. And again, I will take you along for the whole process. From the concept and the first plans, down to the final execution, including all the costs. So, let's start! In the beginning was the problem, in this case coming in the form of multiple moving boxes full of gaming magazines. The vast majority being from the 90s, and while some of them were bought by ourselves, most of them got to us via a deal with an uncle. Which, by the way, is also the reason why in my case the common statement of walkthroughs only becoming accessible via the internet had never been true. In this binder here I exclusively got the middle takeout sections with tips, cheats and walkthroughs of the German Power Play magazines, which, yeah, happened to be green. But back to the topic. The idea was now to give the magazines kind of a second life, by not only using them as decoration, but to also make them available close at hand. And indeed, since the rack is standing here, I already went through some magazines more often than I even thought I would. Either to just browse or to check something specific. However, I was also aware that I actually don't have even space for a proper magazine rack like those you can find in supermarkets or wherever you buy your magazines. These usually have quite a bit of depth, and once there was also a proper table in my room, and a video of that is also coming, I knew there would only be like 50 centimeters left between table and wall. And in order to squeeze past that, you would need like 30 to 40 centimeters, leaving only about 10 to 20 centimeters for any kind of rack. So the next thought must be how you can actually arrange the magazines so that you don't need more depth for each additional row like it's often done in shops. And the solution would be to either tilt them forward or to tilt them backwards. And that would mean that you either cover up the top part or the bottom part. And as we want to see the top part, we need to tilt them forward, and the freed up space can then be used by the magazine behind that. That also means that you will need something which keeps the magazine from just tipping over and falling. While it depends on the angle and how strongly you are going to wedge it in, about half of the height should be a solid value. Then I arranged the magazines in front of me, just like I could imagine seeing them on the rack. Overlapping half of the height actually looks quite good. And when you put the magazines on top of each other horizontally, you will get a maximum depth of about 3 magazines on the thickest point, which is also an important value. My total available space has a width of about 1 meter, and for the height I decided on about 2 meters so that I can still reach the magazines in the top row. In the next step I thought about the angle of tilt which is necessary. Ideally I wanted to have a lower tilt in the bottom rows, which then gets stronger and stronger the higher you go. If you already tilt the bottom row, you would not be able to see the front of it anymore. In addition, this concave curvature has a nice optical effect, a bit like if you were in a round tunnel, looking up at the wall, feeling even more surrounded by that. However, the difference in the angle between the rows isn't huge, and after some testing with drafted models, I realized that you could group multiple units together, resulting in a total of 4 modules, which also simplifies the construction. For additional stability, I also wanted to put that on a pedestal. And of course it would need to be enclosed left and right by 2 panels, which can have a depth of 20 centimeters in the bottom, but only like 10 centimeters higher up to still get by with the hips. Next, I put together a list of all the materials needed and a plan on how to approach the construction. And then I went on my way to the home improvement store. A full list of all the board items will follow a bit later. Now it's time to start crafting, and there we are going to start with the hardest part, the side panels of the rack. In my case, I used the rests of some IKEA cupboards for that, which I would recommend not to do. They are mostly out of cardboard, and for little money you also get some boards out of decent material. So according to my blueprints, a bevel had to be cut into these boards. And of course we also sanded down the edges. You can also have the board cut in the home improvement store for little money or even for free, but chances are they won't cut a bevel. Maybe you are fine with that. As in my case, the cutting of the boards led to having some untreated wood in the front. This has been covered by some edge foil. As in the end the rack is going to stand against the wall, some smaller corners also had been cut out to make room for the skirting. Next up is the pedestal, which is not going to be below the sides but connecting them from in between. So it just needs to be cut to the right size, which can also be done by the home improvement store. Or by a properly skilled father if available, which I can highly recommend. It's time to relax a bit with the next very simple step, at least in my case. With the purchase of the wooden strips which serve as bottom for each shelf, connecting the front and back fiberboards, I made quite a mistake. Partially because the type I originally wanted wasn't readily available. The strips I bought have a width of 25mm to have space for the magazines and a height of 10mm. While I think the width could have been like 2mm smaller, the bigger issue is the height, where I would recommend additional 5 to 15mm, as we are going to put 8 screws into this 10mm side, and chances are not all will be 100% even, meaning some of them will break through. Also, some of the strips were quite malformed and their surface wasn't perfectly smooth. So I decided to use gaffer tape to completely cover the surface to avoid any damage on the magazines by the roughness of the surface and by potential damage on the strips by the screws. Alternatively, you can use a different cover or, well, just buy better wooden strips. Now we will take care of the modules, which do actually require some concentration, especially if you want to do it like me and increase the height of the front boards so far that they will cover the holes on the back row. Meaning that you need to plan accordingly to not cut off your axis to spots you would still need to work on. So generally I recommend to take notes and maybe even think of some mnemonics to help you not to stumble. We are starting at the fiberboard at the very back and drill some holes into it from the backside straight into the wooden strip we covered before. And there we also need to cut in some countersinks so that the screws will not protrude later on. I would not put in the screws just yet though, as this would get extremely bulky very quickly. That strip will also be screwed to about the middle of the height of the backside of the next fiberboard. So we first need to measure out where the holes go and then drill them into the boards. And then, and this is very important, we need to cut in countersinks from the front sides so that the heads of the screws are not going to rub against the magazines later on. And as the wooden strip, which goes behind it, has just been prepared, we can now already add the screws from the front side to the back side of the fiberboard. This element still stays relatively handy for now, but of course we still need to drill the holes on the bottom for the next shelf. And that's what's following next. Drilling, countersinking, but again not using the screws yet, but instead we will put the finished element to the side. And it would be best to mark it accordingly to not lose track which element from which module it was exactly and which side was top and bottom, as the wooden strip is not exactly centered. And this is what we are going to repeat with the next parts: marking the middle, drilling and countersinking, connecting the wooden strip and preparing the bottom of the board. Until we prepare the front for the last element of the module, a fiberglass board which is accordingly a bit smaller. And once that is done, all the elements will get screwed together. Again, I started from the back, and step by step I worked towards the front. And at this point you can also imagine how bulky the whole thing is getting and why you should keep the individual elements separately for as long as possible. The whole process had to be done 4 times in total, 2 times with 4 shelves and 2 times with just 3. With the very bottom module, the fiberboard cover is also a bit larger and is protruding a bit, in order to also cover the pedestal below it later on. Now all the modules are finished. The pedestal can be screwed from the bottom to the first module, and both can be screwed to one of the sideboards. But for the rest, I recommend to do a reality check. Especially these angles are easy to plan in theory, but it kind of fails when you try to replicate them exactly like that in reality. There will be some uneven elements here and there, and you might want to do some last-minute adjustments. So before just drilling all the holes into the sideboards according to the plan, I first put the whole thing on the floor sidewards and then moved around the individual modules, measured them, adjusted them, and then finally marked down the exact positions for each strip on one of the sides so that we can drill the holes according to what we see in reality. For the adjustments and also for the transport, I created and stuck some distance holders into the individual shelves using double-sided tape. And again, I'm recommending to use more solid wooden strips to make your life easier. If you also want to put it on its side for last adjustments like I did here, which is kind of the only practical way thanks to gravity, you should make sure that everything is really even, as there's quite a bit of slack which can have quite an impact if you put it on its side. Now we are going to drill the holes, which will then be used to fixate the modules from the sides. First into the one side panel on which we drew our markings, and then we can use the finished panel as pattern and put it on the other one to be able to make the holes exactly in the right spots on the other side. And while this is now being brought to my flat, we are going to have a look at my total shopping list. First up, we got the fiberboards. For 14 shelves, that is 14 back panels, and 4 front panels, out of which one is a bit longer than the others. They all had been perfectly cut by my home improvement store for little money. Then we got the wooden strips for a total of 14 meters, which will serve as the shelves the magazines stand on. As mentioned, I'd recommend to go for like 23 to 23 mm or something similar rather than the 24 to 10 mm I used. Also make sure that the sides are cut evenly. And if the surfaces aren't smooth, you should add in some gaffer tape. Depending on whether you will have to cut edges on the side panels, you are also going to need some edge foil. I also added in some small black stickers, which we will get to in a few moments. And lastly, there is the socket and both of the side panels themselves. While I used rests of some IKEA cupboards, I would rather recommend some decent boards from the store. In addition, you are going to need about 150 screws, most of them being small countersink screws. When we sum everything up, we are reaching a total of about 180 euros, which is surprisingly cheap, especially if you look at the less optimized but professionally crafted furniture, which is starting at like 500 euros. And with that, let's get back to the magazine rack. Its parts arrived in my flat and are waiting to be put together. And this turned out to be more fiddly in reality than it could have been, also because the strips were so thin. If they had been more solid and more even, then you could have just dropped the screws pretty much into their pre-drilled holes. But the way it was, we had to fiddle around for each screw to make sure that the screw is actually hitting the strip on the other side. Once the module was screwed into place on one of the sides, we carefully turned around the whole rack to also screw in the other side. And so this was going back and forth, and each time the rack became more stable, but also naturally much heavier, until finally everything was put together. For such a thin rack, which is also going to be quite heavy, especially once it's filled up with magazines, it is indispensable to fixate it to the wall. Otherwise it will just tip over with the slightest bump, not exactly leading to the most enjoyable experience. So we got to add some angles to screw it to the wall. As literally the very last points, we are going to add some black stickers onto the front sides of the screws. That way they will be further hidden on the lower rows in case no magazines are going to hide them anyways. In addition, it will also help to eliminate any friction of screws potentially touching the magazines. And with that, everything is ready and it's time to fill it with some magazines. I think it worked out quite well and it looks really cool. One thing you haven't seen in the clip I just showed are the bottom 3 rows, which is just because a shot showing them as well wasn't really practical anymore. But in total I got 14 shelves, which have room for about 15 magazines each. But you could also just put 12 in a row to have a full year of magazines in each shelf, and that would look cool as well. In my case, I got a total of about 200 magazines in the rack now. That is by far not everything I got, but at least it's covering pretty much everything from before year 2000. For the newer magazines, which are also partially so thick that they even got a spine, I found a decent spot in one of my cupboards. Lastly, some additional notes regarding the magazine rack. Generally, I am very happy about how the magazines are being held in place by the individual shelves, so that they are not drooping off to the front. The exception being the magazines to the very right side, where nothing holds the right corner in place. So as small workaround, I used some big black paper clips to fixate them to the board behind them. If you are considering to craft something like that for really valuable magazines or comics, then I'd also recommend to put some cover on the top edges of the fiber plates, as there can be a bit of friction as well. I didn't do that, but on some of my thinner and more valuable magazines I'm using some protective sleeves. Some additional things to improve on are, as mentioned before, the side panels, which I created from rests. And while now, with a finished rack, it doesn't make much of a difference, once I have to move to a new flat, that additional stability from proper boards could have been quite valuable. And of course, the wood strips weren't optimal. Better ones would have made the building process easier and also led to more evenness with the size of each shelf. There are indeed some shelves now which are a bit thicker than others, probably because they are following the slight angle of the strips. But overall I got to say that everything worked out surprisingly well and I'm quite happy about the final result. And as mentioned in the beginning, I've had more magazines in my hands since I got the rack set up than I would have expected. It's just so much more convenient to have this rack standing right next to you than it is to dig through a couple of moving boxes. And that's it from me and my magazine rack. I hope you enjoyed this little crafting excursion, and if this inspires any one of you to create something similar, that would be awesome. Please let me know. While I'm mostly doing reviews and previews about RPGs, tactical and strategy games on this channel, now and then I'm also doing such one-off videos. If you're interested in seeing more, then please also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you haven't watched my video about my shelves in the background here and it looks interesting to you, then that's also something I would recommend. Thank you for watching. I will now browse a bit through my magazines. Hope to see you again next time. Bye bye. Oh, that looks interesting.